The Fairmont's grand ballroom glittered like a city of glass. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations over tables dressed in immaculate white linen, and the soft clink of cutlery, mixed with low, cultivated laughter. It was the kind of night where fortunes were whispered into the right ears, and reputations were polished under the right light. Silicon Valley's elite, plated and perfumed, had come to do what they always did at charity galas: remind the world that they belonged in places where the champagne flowed and the decisions were made. Victoria Whitmore moved through the crowd the way a storm moves. Inevitable, attention-capturing, impossible to ignore. Her gown flashed under the chandeliers. Her manicure was a small, deliberate weapon. Her smile was an economy of teeth, precise and practiced. She had always understood how to occupy a room so completely that the room seemed to revolve around her. Tonight she exuded the confidence of someone who had inherited authority and never been taught to question it. She was not merely a social fixture. She was the kind of presence whose opinion could bend the evening's trajectory. A third-generation Whitmore by marriage, she carried the lineage of a family that had built its name on contracts, on factories, on long relationships with institutions that measured loyalty in decades and dollars. That history sat around her like armor. She wore it without effort, but there was a brittle edge to her armor. The assumption that her place and everyone like her place was natural, unassailable. All evening she dispensed small cruelties that landed like paper cuts. A waiter of Latino descent, young, quick-moving, careful, came near her table with a bottle of champagne, and she sent it back with a delicate hand and a sarcasm-soaked smile. "Do you mind?" she said in the sort of voice that made the waiter apologize for existing. When a valet was slow returning a car, she loudly suggested he might not even have finished high school. She corrected a young Asian woman's networking approach as though social mobility were an affectation better reserved for nobles. Her barbs were not blunt. They were served in the same dainty coupe glasses and polite tones the room used to hide its teeth. That was what made them so effective, cruelty masquerading as etiquette. That night, she floated above the ballroom like a practiced schooner, sensing currents of influence to steer toward herself and away from anyone who dared to drift too close. The man who would disrupt her navigations arrived without any announcement, moving through the crowd with a quiet that felt like dignity. He was tall, his posture a kind of careful observance, and he wore a navy suit tailored to a body that had long been trained to stand straight. He moved like someone who had spent a lifetime aligning himself with purpose, not applause. People in the room recognized him, not with the quick nod given to decorators of art museums or vanity press writers, but with the sober warmth reserved for a person whose competence had earned unspoken respect. Men shook his hand with the kind of grip that meant more than mere ceremony. Conversations paused and continued around his presence as if his name, once spoken, anchored the air. Victoria noticed him because he did not belong, at least by the measure of her prejudices. He occupied the space she believed was reserved for those the world owed its deference to. Where others demonstrated the anxious hustle of social climbing, he demonstrated a calm that looked indistinguishable from belonging. That was the particular affront that made her blood quicken, not his success, but the fact of his composure. She leaned toward Margaret, her longtime ally in the theater of social dominance, thin as a sculpture and as sharp as her husband's suits, and hissed, "Who invited him?" Margaret shrugged, a practiced dismissal. Probably something the organizers did. Diversity, outreach, the usual. Victoria's mouth set. She watched him cross the room and take his seat at a table with Pentagon officials and a handful of tech executives, people with the kind of faces that appeared on trade magazines and whose small nods meant contracts and careers. He seemed at ease, not like someone claiming a seat, but like someone who had been expected all along. The evening progressed along its choreographed notes, plated courses, brief rehearsed toasts, polite laughter. Victoria kept looking across the room, like a captain peeking from the bridge to see whether her ship was still properly admired. The more she saw the man conversed with, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, the more her impatience ossified into something close to rage. She had decided, unilaterally, and with the certainty of a woman who had never been corrected, that this was a wrong. A person of color in a seat meant for those her class assumed was rightfully theirs. Where she saw an error of protocol, she saw an offense to an order she believed important, but protocol, when it is used to guard privilege, often becomes a code for exclusion. At some point during dinner, she stood. It was a small, deliberate motion, one hand smoothing the fabric of her dress, the other steadying the stem of a wine glass. Glass in hand, she crossed the expanse of polished marble with the measured click of heels dictating her arrival. A hush spread. People sensed the disturbance before they understood it. "I think there's been some confusion with the seating arrangements," she announced, loud enough for several tables to redirect forks mid-air. It was the kind of pronouncement designed to shame. She introduced herself as though the syllables of her name carried weight in themselves. "Victoria Whitmore," she said, as if the room needed reminding. "Whitmore Industries. We've been partners with the Department of Defense for over 70 years. Across the table, the man looked up. He was composed, his hands folded, the shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth, the kind only someone who had been tested and hardened could afford. "My invitation specified table 12, he said. His voice was steady, unaffected. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Your invitation?" The question dripped skepticism. "May I ask who sponsored your attendance tonight?" "The Defense Innovation Unit," he replied simply. The words carried no backhandedness. They were a fact, not a provocation. But to Victoria they sounded like an insult. She gave a little laugh, sharp as a shard. "Defense reviews? Evaluation?" She scoffed as though the very idea of him assessing anyone was preposterous. "What are your qualifications?" "An online course, perhaps?" One of the Pentagon officials shifted, discomfort creasing her face. The conversation was slanting into awkwardness, and Victoria did not know when to stop. She pushed farther, taking advantage of the hush. "Too many unqualified people have been getting opportunities they haven't earned simply because of the color of their skin," she said, letting the words hang in the air, the kind of phrase that carved clean through the pretense of civility. There was an audible collective intake of breath. Someone fumbled for a phone. Others, like Margaret, shuffled closer with the instinctive loyalty of those raised in the same schools of social cruelty. Positioning herself just so, Victoria was ready to deliver the coup de grace of her evening's performance, an assertion of hierarchy. From his pocket, the man pulled a handkerchief and dabbed at the condensation on his glass, preparing himself for whatever humiliation she intended. He had been taking notes all evening, not on the menu or the light fixtures, but on the character of certain guests. He had been watching how they treated staff, how they laughed at those they thought lesser. He had watched enough to know the measure of a person when it mattered. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Victoria snapped, the words shaped by a lifetime of entitlement. "My family has been serving this country since before you people even had the right to vote. Even the mantle of old money has a vocabulary of its own, phrases that imply a history of unassailable precedents." The room registered the poison in her tone. The music thinned. Conversations dimmed. He remained calm. Calm to the point of something that felt almost like a smile, not an angry or bitter smile, but the kind of smile you give someone who is, in that very moment, unraveling the last thread of their own dignity without even knowing it. "You people need to learn your place," he imagined she might say. But those were her words, not his. Instead, she lifted her glass higher, an imperious finality in the gesture, and said the words everyone would forever remember. "Get this monkey away from my table." The phrase detonated in the hush. A crude, hateful punctuation. Glass met air. Red wine arced like a short-lived comet and smashed down across the man's head, across the tailored navy of his suit, across the white linen of the table. It streamed down his face and fell in crimson beads onto the tablecloth, dark and shocking as spilled blood. The sound of the glass striking the saucer was a sharp, obscene punctuation that made it impossible to pretend the evening had not just become something else. Phones were up before any response had had a chance to solidify into meaning. Cameras rolled. The reaction in the room fractured into 1,000 small narratives. A gasp, a hand to a mouth, a stillness that felt like someone holding their breath through an entire life-spun error. The waiter near the table froze mid-step. The three Pentagon officials looked at one another with expressions that mixed incredulity and horror. The tech executives exchanged glances that combined outrage and the cold arithmetic of reputational risk. For the man who had been doused, the immediate actor was the wine's physicality, cool, wet, intrusive. He dabbed at the stain with a handkerchief as if he were performing a small private ritual of composure. He could have been any dignified figure, elegant, annoyed. He could have erupted. Instead, he chose to stand with a kind of measured calm that looked rehearsed but was probably the product of someone who had learned the value of self-possession in far higher cost situations. Very revealing, he said softly, and the room felt as though someone had switched the music mid-dance. The line landed not as a clap but as a scalpel. It hinted that he had seen much more than a single act. He had seen character laid bare. "This has been very educational," he added, his voice low, precise. Security advanced, 3 people moving through the crowd with polite urgency, but he raised a hand to stop them. It would have been theatrical in any other circumstance. In that room, however, it was an act of moral discipline. He did not want her removed. He did not want a scene. He wanted to make sure everyone in that room understood what had transpired. Because the damage was not merely to him, but to the institution and the culture that had allowed such an act to be imagined as acceptable. Victoria basked in the immediate rush of triumph. Her friend smiled and nodded. Margaret reached forward as if to steady her crown. She had known how to play the room, a decisive blow to assert boundaries of class and entitlement. Only this time the blow did not land as intended. Phones had already begun their slow upward arc to the internet. In the absence of immediate censorship, people recorded what they saw. Clips started to appear on feeds within minutes, first shaky, then clearer, then slowed down in some edits to show the arc of wine in ugly, elegant replay. The internet, always a hungry animal for spectacle, began to consume the evening in real time. The phrase, the act, the look on his face as the wine trickled down. Victoria, still standing with the satisfaction of someone who had leveled a social lance, set the empty glass down with a sharp clink arranged by design, not accident. She delivered one last line, a phrase shaped to be carried. "Did you really think you belonged here?" The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. But the audience, the room, and the world beyond heard something different. The stink of an institution revealed. Where Victoria expected applause, she found silence, or worse, discomfort. The smiles that had been in her orbit thinned as those closest to corporate power looked at one another with a new calculation. Was this behavior theirs? Did they share this accountability? The room, for the first time that night, held its breath not out of shock at the spectacle, but because the spectacle had become evidence. Damon Richardson, because that was who sat in the navy suit. And names will be what names are when recorded and replayed. Cleaned at his jacket with the same careful motions with which he had cleaned his uniform in other rooms and other years. He stood and, with a quiet authority that matched his bearing, folded the handkerchief and addressed the room in words that would be remembered not for their volume, but for their clarity. "Interesting choice, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Very revealing." It was an assessment, not an accusation. He did not shout. He did not demand to be made whole by apologies. He recorded the act into the ledger that matters in every sphere, character. Victoria smiled for a moment, a small, satisfied curl at the edge of her mouth. A smile that did not register that the world outside the table had already begun to spin toward a verdict. The cameras had started to pick up the expressions of those who had watched them, faces of those who had been excluded their whole lives, lips pursed. The faces of executives calculating the cost of associating with such public cruelty. On the periphery, someone's phone was already sending a clip out into the ether, and algorithmic appetite would carry it from feed to feed faster than any of them could imagine. Security hovered, awkwardly navigating protocol and optics. But the more men in suits moved, the more the world watched. Someone began to whisper, "Record it," and within moments 1,000 small microphones collected the scene. The video feed surged outward, a woman in a silver gown dumping a glass of red wine over a man who stood, calm as a statue, and then speaking words shaped like an old-world decree. Hashtags were born in the space between the clink of glass and the waterline of the spilled wine. The phrase "Winegate" did not exist yet, but by morning it would, and yet at that precise moment, even as phones rose and the social tissue began to tear, the man who had been humiliated did something the room did not expect. He smiled. It was not a smile of triumph. It was not an angry smile. It was the smile of someone who understood consequence, someone who had waited longer and seen further than the blinked and the bread. He dabbed at his jacket with a handkerchief, one neat, practiced motion. "I think Mrs. Whitmore has made her position quite clear," he said, and left the sentence hanging like a verdict. "This has been very educational," he added, and with that he stood, adjusted his tie, and walked away. Phones were already funneling footage to networks and feeds, uncurated and immediate. Someone uploaded a clip to a social platform. The upload time, the tags, the first outraged comment stitched together 1,000 minds into one public reaction. Several guests looked at the screens in real time, watching the recording that would define the night and possibly their futures. Victoria remained there for a fragmented moment longer, basking in what she thought of as moral clarity. Her reward, she believed, would be the admiration of peers and the reassertion of social order. Instead, a different kind of order began to assert itself, a reckoning less theatrical and more inexorable. The digital world, hungry for scandal and swift with judgment, had begun to move. On that night, under the chandeliers and before the faces of the powerful, a single act of cruelty had been captured in a way that turned an attempt to humiliate into a crime scene for reputation. When he left the ballroom, cameras continued to record the echo of what had happened. The clip would climb and comments would thread its edges. People would speculate about motive. Pundits would pen hot takes about class and race. Late-night hosts would reserve a segment. But in the quiet that followed long after, heels had clicked away and last calls were given. The true thing that had been revealed was not the wine itself, but the worldview that allowed a woman to pour it over another human being and think it a victory. Victoria had meant to make a spectacle of someone else. In the instant between the throw and the spill, you could see the shape of her mistake. She had assumed the fullness of her power was absolute. She had not accounted for the one thing no lineage or wealth can buy: moral authority. And as the videos began to spread, as the first hashtags winked into being on glowing screens outside the ballroom, the night that was supposed to cement social standing became the scene of a different transaction. Not of favors and contracts, but of a swift and public moral audit. The jewel-laden ballroom, so skilled at preserving appearances, had just been cracked open. The stain at the center of the table would not wash away. The morning after, the world that had been so carefully arranged around Victoria Whitmore's gestures and judgments felt as if someone had knocked a hand through a stained glass window. Phones glowed on kitchen counters and in cabs. Television anchors fed off one another in real time. The feeds outran the people who'd made them. The clip from the gala, Victoria's glass arcing, the wine turning a man's navy suit into something that looked like a wound, had appeared everywhere. It arrived at first as a raw, messy video, then as a sharpened narrative. A woman of privilege humiliating a stranger in front of the powerful. The angle was cheap and lethal. Victoria did not wake to regret. She woke to outrage and then, astonishingly, to a new kind of righteousness. While people across the internet condemned her on a scale she'd never experienced, she doubled down. An early morning post from her account, uploaded with a mix of defiance and calculated composure, read like a manifesto. "Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right. Real Americans shouldn't have to apologize for defending our values and our institutions. Our truth matters. Real talk. No apologies." The hashtags were clumsy and the grammar worse, but the purpose was clear. Victoria had decided she would not be shamed into silence. If the world wanted drama, she would supply conviction. That post tasted like gasoline to everyone outside her inner circle. Her comments flooded with fury. 30,000 replies in 4 hours. A tidal wave of disbelief and disgust that overwhelmed the polite outrage statements from dinner guests and the stunned silence of some of the gala's sponsors. Screenshots multiplied. Clips looped on news sites between pundits who wanted to dissect and viewers who wanted to lynch. Digitally, the person whose arrogance had been caught so precisely on camera. In the Whitmore house, the ripple became an earthquake. James woke to his phone blinking like a machine under stress. He glanced at the headlines, saw snatches of the clip embedded in morning news sidebars, and felt the first cold spike of fear. He called Victoria. She was mid-interview on a local cable show, chin tilted beneath studio lights, explaining herself with a practiced mixture of indignation and self-justification. This was necessary, she told the host. Words chosen with that peculiar certainty of someone who believes her own righteousness. We can't let token gestures and quotas replace merit. I did what any of us would have done to preserve our standards. James watched her on a tiny screen in his home office and felt the room tilt. He had married into this world of legacy, of contracts and reputations held together by protocol and careful denial. He had always thought they could manage a scandal. Hire a PR team, issue a statement, wait for the storm to pass. But this was different. This was not a discreet corporate misstep amenable to a mea culpa. This was a moral spectacle, captured on millions of phones and shared with a velocity that made reconciliation almost impossible. By the time the markets opened, well before most people had finished their second cup of coffee, Whitmore Industries, ticker flashed red. Pre-market trades, algorithmic and brutal, began to eat away at the company's valuation like termites. Down 8%, down 12%, down 15%. The numbers scrolled across the screen while James sat frozen, his coffee cooling, forgotten at his elbow. The algorithms didn't care about nuance or intent. They responded to social contagion, to reputational risk, to the possibility that partners and procurement officers would recoil. Investors called. Board members sent terse texts. Subcontractors asked for reassurances that were impossible to give. James tried to assemble a defense. Lawyers, a hastily convened PR team, damage control personnel. But damage control is an office with rules, and none of its forms applied to a video in which a woman had poured wine over a man and then doubled down on national television. In his quieter moments, James's anxiety focused on one unanswerable question. Who was the man in the Navy suit? The more he replayed the clip, the more he realized he had been standing in the same room with someone who had commanded the respect of the Pentagon, officials without ostentation, and who had refused to turn a public humiliation into a public fight. That calm, that composure suggested someone whose life was trained to hold still in emergencies. It suggested someone with leverage. "Get me everything you can find on that man," James told his assistant, the words leaving his mouth crisp and desperate. Full background. Employment history. Social media. Everything. It was the kind of instruction he'd given 1,000 times in other, less destabilizing contexts. But now it came with an urgency that made the assistant's fingers fly. 3 hours later, the report arrived, and it read like a mystery. The man's history was spare. Born in Detroit, enlisted young, West Point graduate, long career in uniform. There were photos and public records, medals, a posture of service. But the usual windows into a modern life were missing. No LinkedIn account, no Twitter, virtually no presence that a CEO could use to call, to threaten, to flatter. It was an absence that by itself spoke volumes. "You sure you checked everywhere?" James asked, his voice thin. "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. "There's almost nothing. People in classified positions sometimes have scrubbed online footprints for security reasons. If he's affiliated with certain agencies, his profile could accurately be minimal." James felt as if someone had reached into his gut and tightened a hand around his ribs. Classified. Government. He had paid attention to the defense, innovation unit in board meetings and trade shows. But he had never expected to meet someone who could, at a moment's notice, flip the moral calculus on a company whose name had been trusted for generations. The panic multiplied beyond the ticker. Calls came in from procurement partners asking for explanations. A subcontractor postponed a scheduled meeting. A respected client requested an emergency review of their contracts. It became rapidly clear that what Victoria had thought of as a social corrective had already metastasized into corporate catastrophe. Victoria's own media tour did not help. Studios that had previously afforded her the polite distance due to socialite interviewees now pressed for more. Live defense, a willingness to be contradicted. She sat on panels, recited the same justifications, and each time, the public reaction hardened. Journalists replayed the clip with commentary. Editorial pages wrote long condemnations. A smear of red on a navy suit became a symbol. And human beings, investors, civil rights leaders, military ethicists, applied the symbol to a larger pattern. By mid-morning, James's private world had become a very public collapse. On the second call from a board member, an older voice, steady, urgent, said something that made him straighten as if struck. "James, who is that man?" The voice demanded. "Find out, now." James realized he needed help beyond a background check. The usual channels were not sufficient. This required knowledge of how government contracts were allocated, and who in the Pentagon carried the weight of reputational judgment. He picked up the phone and called a contact, someone who had navigated the corridors of defense procurement for years. The line was discreet. The answer made his appetite for denial evaporate. "That's not just any evaluator," the contact said. "If it's who I think it is, you've just embarrassed yourself in front of someone who holds real power." The call was brief and left James scrambling for a plan he did not possess. He returned to the footage, watching the man's composure again and again. There was an economy in the man's movements that bespoke long training, small, precise gestures, and economy of speech. He had not sought spectacle. He had recorded it. While James attempted to triage corporate fallout, the world outside his living room became a chorus of judgment. Social media churned through narratives. Some framed Victoria as the last defender of old country meritocracy. More framed her as the archetype of entitlement unbound. Pundits argued. Activists organized. The clip was dissected for evidence of classism, for signs of systemic bias, for the cultural arrogance that enabled one person to believe she could pour wine over another and expect sympathy. Some responses were immediate and practical. An influential procurement partner paused negotiations. A coalition of civil rights groups demanded inquiries and transparency. The Defense Innovation Unit, whatever its inner workings, became a topic of conversation beyond its usual circles, which was the last thing any of the Whitmore board had anticipated. As the morning stretched toward midday, James's phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He could see by the area code that the call originated from an official channel. The voice on the other end, precise, no-nonsense, did not afford him the courtesy of small talk. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon Personnel Office," the caller said. "We need to schedule a meeting regarding last night's incident. Please come in at 2 o'clock. James felt the world drop another few degrees. The specifics of the call were brief and clinical. "It concerns the evaluation process for recent and pending contracts," she said. "You will receive details in a secure transmission." The line went dead. James sat alone with the phone in his hand and heard the echo of that voice. His coffee had gone cold. The pre-market numbers on his screen declared a kind of corporate fever he had never navigated. He thought of his children, of the images their grandparents' name had stood for. It was a stunning inversion of the life he had known. The company that had once been an unwavering source of pride was now under the scalpel of public scrutiny. He tried to call Victoria, but the morning's interviews had not ceased. She was still explaining, still defending, still believing she had done the right thing. James's text to her sat marked read and unanswered. The assistant placed fresh dossiers on his desk, legal options, PR scripts, lists of donors whose calls needed to be returned. None of it made the suddenness of the situation less real. Outside, the city carried on inverting itself around the story. Coffee shops read the headlines aloud to patrons. Taxi drivers were animatedly discussing what they'd seen. The algorithms that had first punished Whitmore Industries were not finished. More trades arrived, more drops in value, more frantic emails from investors who feared contagion. James realized he would have to decide quickly whether to treat this as a private marital scandal or as the corporate betrayal it had become. He straightened his shoulders, tried to compose his face into a mask that would suggest control. He called his assistant back. "Book the earliest secure transport," he said, voice steadying. "Make sure legal joins me, and cancel all interviews. No one speaks on behalf of the company except me." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, Colonel Hayes asked for you at 2. "I know," James replied. "Then that's where I'll be." He hung up and, for a moment, allowed himself to look out the window of his study at the glittering city, the same skyline that had once promised opportunity and now offered public ruin. The clip had traveled faster than any apology could travel. Victoria's insistence had lit a fuse that was now consuming decades of legacy. The pre-market numbers continued to blink red. The board wanted answers. The Pentagon wanted to see him. And somewhere in that swirl of panic and PR memos and investor calls, there was a new unignorable fact. The man in the Navy suit had not responded to humiliation with rage. He had used it to reveal character, to make a judgment that would not be confined to a single night. James felt, with a clarity that made his pulse thud, that the consequences of Victoria's action were about to become a reckoning, not only for his family and company, but for an industry that had been allowed to operate in the shadow of unexamined privilege. He turned his chair back toward the desk and began to prepare for an appointment that would, he suspected, determine whether Whitmore Industries could survive the moment its founder's granddaughter had turned a wine glass into a symbol of a deeper rot. The Pentagon sat in stillness that morning, massive and cold, its corridors alive with the quiet hum of decisions that moved armies and altered economies. Inside, the air carried the scent of order, coffee and paper, carpet and authority. James Whitmore walked through it like a man already condemned, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He had spent his life inside boardrooms that traded in confidence, but here, confidence meant nothing. Every step brought him closer to the truth he'd been dreading since dawn. That the man his wife had humiliated was not some peripheral bureaucrat, but a gatekeeper to everything his company depended on. The escort led him into a conference room with walls of muted gray and a table that looked heavy enough to anchor the world. Seated at the far end was the man from the gala, his posture straight, his uniform immaculate, his eyes unreadable. Around him sat 4 others: Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon Personnel Office, Amanda Carter, liaison to the Secretary of Defense, and 2 officials from the Defense Innovation Unit. Their expressions were calm but not kind. This was not a meeting. It was a tribunal. "Please have a seat, Mr. Whitmore," the man said. His voice carried a quiet command that left no room for pretense. James sat, the chair's leather groaning under him. "General Richardson," he began, the name tasting strange, too heavy to swallow. "I need you to know my wife's behavior was unacceptable. I'm here to take full responsibility." General Damon Richardson regarded him for a long moment before answering. "You're correct, Mr. Whitmore, it was unacceptable, and it revealed more than either of you intended." The words landed like a stone dropped in deep water. James nodded, gripping the edge of the table. "She spoke out of ignorance. She doesn't represent our company's values." "That's precisely what I'm here to determine," Richardson said evenly. "Because you see, Mr. Whitmore, when we evaluate potential partners, we don't only examine specifications, capabilities, or costs. We evaluate character." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her fingers steepled. "Our contracts place billions of taxpayer dollars and lives into the hands of private companies. We have to know who we're trusting. We look for integrity, respect, and cultural alignment." James swallowed hard. "Of course. I understand completely, and do you?" Richardson asked quietly. "Because last night your wife demonstrated a great deal about Whitmore Industries' culture, and about its leadership. Her actions weren't just a personal failure. They were a reflection of what your organization tolerates." The other officials remained silent, letting the words settle like dust in the air. James could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. With respect, General, my wife has no formal role in the company. She's not an employee, not an executive. Richardson studied him. She is your spouse, the primary shareholder's partner, and the public face of your family name. That carries weight. Her words and actions reflect your corporate values whether you wish them to or not. Amanda Carter opened a folder and slid several printed pages across the table. James's eyes fell on the images, still frames from the viral video, followed by screenshots of Victoria's social media posts. Each one was a nail in the coffin. Her sneer, the glass tilting, the red stain, and beneath it her 2 a.m. declaration, real Americans shouldn't have to apologize. Your wife called me a monkey, Mr. Whitmore, Richardson said, the words even and almost gentle, but with a gravity that made the room shrink, in front of 3 Pentagon officials, 2 major defense contractors, and roughly 300 witnesses. Then she went on national television and doubled down. You see, racism doesn't merely insult individuals, it corrodes trust. And trust is the foundation of national security. James tried to speak, but no words came. The images kept looping in his mind. The wine spilling like blood, the cameras flashing, the disbelief on people's faces. Richardson continued, his voice calm but edged with steel. Before last night, Whitmore Industries was one of our top candidates for the Next Generation UAV initiative, a $1.2 billion contract. Your technical proposal was excellent. Your pricing was competitive. Your record was strong. But character matters, and your wife made your values unmistakably clear. The room fell silent. The hum of the air conditioning seemed suddenly louder. James could feel the enormity of what was being said pressing down on him like a physical weight. Colonel Hayes broke the quiet. We've also been reviewing your internal culture reports, Mr. Whitmore. In the past 5 years, Whitmore Industries has settled multiple discrimination lawsuits, 2 out of court, 1 with a documented finding of a hostile work environment for minority employees. That's not representative of who we are, James stammered. We've taken steps to improve, new training programs, HR audits. Richardson raised a hand, silencing him. Words are easy, Mr. Whitmore. Behavior tells the truth. Last night told us everything we needed to know. He stood walking to a wall-mounted screen. With a touch, he brought up a series of photographs, grainy, decades old, showing a young black man in fatigues, then the same man in officer's insignia, then standing in a line of decorated personnel. Let me tell you who I am, he said quietly. I enlisted at 18, served 3 tours overseas, worked my way up, 1 rank at a time through every kind of prejudice you can imagine. I've been called every name you can think of. I've been underestimated by people who looked at my skin and decided they already knew my limits. And every one of them gave me something valuable, an understanding of their character. He turned back toward James, his voice tightening, not with anger, but with conviction. I oversee the Defense Innovation Unit's annual budget, $50 billion. I personally approve or reject every major technology partnership the Pentagon enters into. When your wife humiliated me last night, she didn't just insult a man. She insulted the values that hold this country together. James's throat went dry. General, please. She was drinking. She was under stress. Richardson cut him off. Alcohol doesn't create racism. It reveals it. Stress doesn't invent prejudice. It exposes what was already there. The line was clean and merciless. James sat frozen, realizing that any attempt to defend his wife only made the hole deeper. Across the table, Amanda Carter closed her folder. The UAV contract has been awarded to another company, she said flatly. Effective this morning. James's head snapped up. But please, you can't mean— We can, Richardson replied. And we do. Northrop Grumman will take over your bid. The decision is final. The silence afterward was suffocating. James felt his chest tighten. That contract had been their salvation. The one thing that could have stabilized the company for the next decade. Losing it meant layoffs, lawsuits, perhaps bankruptcy. His entire legacy, his family's name, was unraveling, all because of a single moment of unrestrained arrogance. Furthermore, Colonel Hayes added. The Department of Defense is initiating a full review of all existing Whitmore Industries contracts. Any evidence of cultural or ethical deficiencies will result in immediate termination. James looked around the room, desperate for something to hold on to, some hint of mercy. There was none. The faces around the table were not cruel. They were resolute. This was not vengeance, it was accountability. Richardson returned to his seat and folded his hands. There is one thing you can do, he said, if you want to preserve any future at all in this industry. James leaned forward, his voice small. Anything. Publicly remove your wife from any role or affiliation with the company. Announce comprehensive leadership training and external oversight for diversity, inclusion, and workplace equity. Issue a formal apology. Not a statement of regret, but an acknowledgement of the harm her actions caused. And mean it. Yes, James said quickly. Absolutely. Whatever it takes. Richardson nodded once. Understand, Mr. Whitmore. None of this will bring back the UAV contract. That opportunity is gone. But what you do next will determine whether Whitmore Industries has any credibility left. James sat back, deflated. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. I understand, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Richardson gathered the documents in front of him, sliding them into a folder marked Closed Evaluation. He stood, extending a hand, not in friendship but in finality. I didn't come here to destroy your company, he said. I came here to ensure that our partners reflect the integrity of the people we serve. Sometimes that means letting old systems fall so new ones can be built. James hesitated, then took the offered hand. It was firm, deliberate, the handshake of a man who commanded empires without ever raising his voice. When he left the room, the fluorescent corridors of the Pentagon felt endless. The world outside the building seemed to hum with a new kind of scrutiny. Every reporter's camera, every investor's call, every whispered headline, all of it now carried the echo of the decision made in that room. He paused in the hallway, his reflection ghosted in the glass. For the first time, he saw himself not as a CEO, not as the heir to a dynasty, but as the man who had allowed silence to grow where principle should have stood. He thought of Victoria's face in the ballroom, the tilt of her glass, the sharpness in her voice when she said, "You people." He had let it slide 1,000 times in private, laughed it off, excused it as just her way. Now the bill had come due. When he finally stepped outside, the sun seemed harsher than usual, the air heavier. Reporters were already gathering near the front gates, microphones like bayonets angled for his first word. He ignored them, walked to his car, and sat there in stillness, staring at his phone. There were 17 missed calls from Victoria. He didn't answer. The engine hummed to life, but he couldn't bring himself to drive away just yet. The conversation replayed in his mind, every phrase weighted with consequence. Alcohol doesn't create racism. It reveals it. He had never heard truer words. What he had witnessed in that conference room was not just a professional reprimand. It was history's scales balancing themselves, cold and precise. James knew what awaited him at home. A storm of denial, anger, rationalization. But the greater reckoning had already begun. Whitmore Industries would never again be the same. Neither would he. He looked one last time at the massive building behind him, its windows reflecting the hard blue of the sky, and realized that the man his wife had tried to humiliate had just redrawn the boundaries of power in their world. It was no longer about money or contracts or connections. It was about conscience. As he finally pulled out of the lot, his phone buzzed again. A text from his brother, the company's COO. 3 subcontractors pulled out. Boeing wants to reevaluate. Dad called an emergency board meeting. You'd better get home. He didn't reply. For the first time in his career, he had no words to fix what was broken. The road stretched ahead, and every mile seemed to strip away another layer of the illusion that had kept him safe all these years. Legacy, pedigree, privilege, none of it mattered now. The truth had been exposed in a single indelible image, a glass of red wine spilling like blood, and the calm, dignified man who refused to retaliate. Somewhere behind him, in an office lit by cold fluorescent light, General Damon Richardson was already drafting the new standard by which every defense contractor in America would be judged. not by profit, but by principle. And for the first time in decades, the weight of that truth felt heavier than any weapon. The Whitmore mansion stood on the crest of Redwood Hill, a structure of glass and arrogance. Its windows reflected the pale afternoon light, but inside every reflection was fractured. Reporters had already gathered beyond the gates, their cameras aimed like rifles at the front door. The air smelled of scandal, of something decaying beneath the marble surface of legacy. When James stepped inside, the house no longer felt like his. A film crew occupied the living room. Ring lights, microphones, a host in an expensive blazer perched on the sofa beside his wife. Victoria Whitmore was speaking into the camera as though addressing a congregation. Her tone was righteous, rehearsed, and dripping with self-pity. "What people don't understand," she said to the podcast host beside her, "is that I was standing up for American values, for merit, for hard work. Someone had to say what everyone else was thinking." The host nodded eagerly, sensing a ratings boost. "And you don't regret it?" "Not one bit." "None whatsoever," Victoria said proudly. "If I had to do it again, I would. This country used to respect people who earned their place. Now everyone's afraid of being called names for telling the truth." James stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, watching the scene unfold like a parody of defiance. The woman who had poured wine on another human being was doubling down with the same conviction that had once made her charming. She looked immaculate, hair styled, makeup flawless, confidence unbroken. But beneath the glow of the studio lights, she looked hollow. He reached forward and switched off the main light. The sudden dimness startled everyone. "That's enough," he said quietly. The crew turned. The host's expression shifted from curiosity to fear. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, we were just out," James said. "All of you, now," the host stammered, gathering his notes. Assistants scrambled to unplug equipment, tripping over cables. Within minutes, the crew had vanished, leaving the faint smell of burnt electronics and perfume. Victoria stood indignant. "What on earth are you doing?" "That was a live interview." James stared at her, his voice trembling, not from rage but exhaustion. "Do you know who that man was, Victoria?" She crossed her arms. "I already told you, some diversity hire who thought he belonged at my table." "His name," James said slowly, "is Damon Richardson. He's the man who runs the Defense Innovation Unit, the one who controls $50 billion in military contracts. You poured wine on the person responsible for deciding the future of this company." Her face faltered, the first crack in the marble. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It's fact," James said. "You didn't just insult a guest. You humiliated the very person who could have saved us. And you did it in front of the entire Pentagon." She laughed nervously, as though trying to transform the moment into farce. "Then why didn't anyone say something? Why didn't he stop me?" "Because he didn't need to," James said. "He already had all the power he needed." Victoria's laughter died. The silence that followed was jagged. James stepped closer, his voice low, heavy. "You lost us the UAV contract, $1.2 billion. It went to Northrop this morning. And that's just the beginning. The Pentagon is reviewing all our existing contracts, every single one." Her eyes widened, disbelief turning to panic. "That's insane. They can't do that over one incident." "They can," James replied. "And they are." She shook her head violently. No, there has to be a way to fix this. I'll apologize, send a letter." "It's too late for letters," he said. "You went on national television this morning defending your actions. You turned a scandal into an ideology." Victoria's voice broke into something between desperation and denial. "I was protecting our family. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, people watching, judging." "I understand perfectly," James said. "You weren't protecting us. You were protecting your ego." The argument was cut short by a buzz on his phone. He looked down. A message from his brother Michael, the company's COO, emergency board meeting. "Father's orders. Be there in an hour." James looked up. "They've called a meeting." "About what?" she asked. "About you," he said, and walked away. The boardroom of Whitmore Industries was a monument to legacy. Dark wood, portraits of patriarchs, the family crest etched into glass. But now every face around the long oval table carried the same expression. Cold condemnation. At the head sat Richard Whitmore, Victoria's father. 80 years old, white hair combed back, eyes like flint. He had built this empire from munitions and government contracts, from the old wartime ethics of steel and certainty. And his daughter, his pride, had undone it in less than 24 hours. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice calm but edged with fury. "Explain to me what you were thinking." Victoria sat in the chair across from him. Her once impeccable posture was slightly slumped, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. "Daddy, I was defending our reputation." That man, he was out of place. He didn't belong there. A woman at the table, Patricia Collins, a former defense official turned board member, interrupted. "That man," she said sharply, "was Damon Richardson. I served under him overseas. He's one of the most respected leaders in the military." Victoria's jaw slackened. The room's air seemed to thicken. Another voice joined in. William Hayes, former Secretary of Defense and one of the company's oldest allies. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this company's reputation? 15 clients have already suspended contracts. Boeing is reassessing our partnership, and the Pentagon is investigating our culture." Victoria looked to her father for rescue. "This is a misunderstanding. People are twisting the story." Richard's voice was ice. "The story isn't being twisted, Victoria. It's being watched by the entire country." Collins opened a laptop and turned it toward the table. On the screen, clips of Victoria's interviews, her posts, her defiance. Each one landed like a blow. "This," Collins said, "isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern." Richard leaned forward. "Do you know what I see when I look at these videos? I see a woman so obsessed with status that she destroyed her family's company to protect it." "I was standing up for American values," Victoria said faintly. Her father slammed his hand on the table. "Is racism an American value?" The sound echoed through the room. No one breathed. He continued, quieter now but far more dangerous. "You humiliated a man who has served this country longer than you've been alive. You mocked him in front of the Department of Defense. You made our name synonymous with hate." Victoria's mother, Eleanor, spoke softly from the far end of the table. "We warned you, dear. For years we ignored your temper, your condescension, the way you treated staff. We said it was harmless. But now you've made it national." Another file appeared on the screen. Lawsuits, internal HR reports, employee complaints buried by executives afraid of her influence. Collins read them aloud. Wrongful termination, workplace hostility, racial discrimination. "We settled all of this quietly," she said. "Now the press has them." Victoria's eyes darted from face to face. "You can't all just turn on me. I am Whitmore Industries." Richard stood, his voice trembling, not with weakness but with age and heartbreak. "You were, Victoria. Until now." He looked at the others around the table. "By the authority vested in me as chairman of this board, I am removing Victoria Whitmore from all positions within this company, effective immediately." Her mouth fell open. "Daddy, you can't." "I can," he said. "And I must. You are a liability. You've become poison to everything we built." He turned to James. "Your shares will remain, but as of today, she has no access to company assets. Her trust fund is frozen pending a full investigation into her actions and their impact on corporate value." The board members voted, one by one. Every hand rose in agreement. Even Eleanor, her own mother, lifted hers last, reluctant but firm. The verdict was sealed. Victoria stared at them all, her voice breaking. "You're doing this to your own daughter." Her father's expression softened for a single moment. "I'm doing this to save her soul," he said quietly. "Maybe losing everything is the only way you'll learn what anything means." She turned to James, desperate. "You're not going to let them do this to me, are you?" James met her gaze, and for the first time his voice was calm. Not angry, not pleading, just tired. "I filed for divorce this morning. The papers will be served tomorrow." It was as though the floor fell away. Victoria looked around the table, searching for a face that wasn't condemning her, but found none. The people who had once laughed at her jokes, who had praised her taste, now looked at her as though she were a stranger. Richard dismissed the meeting. One by one the members filed out, murmuring to assistants, making calls to investors. When the room emptied, Victoria remained seated, staring at the polished table as if she could will it to remember the power she used to hold. Eleanor walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I hope someday you understand that what you lost today wasn't your fortune. It was your humanity." Victoria didn't respond. She sat perfectly still, a statue in the ruins of her own empire. Outside the boardroom, James stood alone in the hallway, watching as executives passed by whispering. For years, this building had felt like an extension of himself, a monument to success. Now it felt like a mausoleum. He should have felt triumphant, liberated even, but all he felt was hollow. He thought of Damon Richardson, how calm he'd been under humiliation, how controlled, how dignified. In that one moment of silence, Damon had shown more leadership than all the Whitmores combined. James understood now that the general hadn't needed revenge. The truth had done the work for him. As he walked out of the building, a crowd of journalists gathered by the gates shouted questions. "Is it true your wife's been removed? Is Whitmore collapsing?" James said nothing. The cameras caught his silence, but silence, at least, could not be misquoted. Back at the mansion, Victoria was gone. Her car had vanished, her phone left on the kitchen counter. The house felt cavernous without her, empty of sound but heavy with ghosts. He sat in the study and poured himself a drink he didn't want. Outside, the city lights flickered like restless judgment. Somewhere out there, Victoria was discovering what it meant to be truly powerless. For the first time in her life, no one was answering her calls, no one was defending her. No one cared about her version of the story. She had once believed that power was inherited, that privilege was protection. But in a single act of arrogance, she had burned her inheritance to ash, and from that ash, the world would build something new, something she could no longer control. The Whitmore dynasty had fallen not by scandal alone, but by truth revealed under the glare of public light. The same chandeliers that had once reflected gold now reflected only the fragments of broken glass. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain when Victoria Whitmore appeared before the cameras again, not as a society queen or the heir to a billion-dollar empire, but as a woman stripped of title, wealth, and pride. Her lawyer stood beside her, holding a trembling umbrella that did little to shield her from the barrage of flashbulbs. She clutched a piece of paper with both hands, its edges shaking. Once her voice could silence a room. Now it barely carried above the sound of protesters shouting her name. "I want to publicly apologize to..." She hesitated, swallowing the weight of words she had never spoken before. "To General Damon Richardson for my inexcusable behavior. My actions were wrong, hurtful, and do not represent the values this country stands for." The crowd murmured. Some booed, others just watched, unmoved. Everyone could see she was reading from a script, the words flat and bloodless. Behind her, homemade signs waved through the drizzle. "Accountability is justice. No more privilege without consequence. Racism isn't an accident. It was the performance of a woman cornered, not yet redeemed." She had been ordered to deliver this statement as part of a plea agreement to settle multiple civil suits, but even the judge had doubted her sincerity. The press called it the hollow apology. When she stepped away from the podium, cameras chased her. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you sorry for what you did or just sorry you got caught?" one reporter shouted. She didn't answer. Her lawyer ushered her toward a waiting car, the umbrella trembling between them. As the vehicle door shut, the crowd's noise faded behind the glass, replaced by the steady hum of rain. For a long moment, she stared out the window. The courthouse blurred into gray, her reflection fractured across the glass. It was still strange to her. How easily she could become the villain of a story she had once believed she was writing. Across the river, at the Pentagon, General Damon Richardson stood before a smaller crowd of reporters. His uniform was immaculate, his posture calm, his voice measured. He did not gloat. He did not condemn. "Mrs. Whitmore's apology is noted," he said simply. "But this was never about one person or one incident. This was about ensuring that every institution, every partner we trust upholds the values that define us. Respect, dignity, and equality. We cannot afford hypocrisy in the defense of freedom." The statement lasted less than 2 minutes, Yet within hours it had traveled farther and faster than any speech he had ever given. People shared it not because it was fiery, but because it was dignified. In an age of outrage, restraint had become revolutionary. That afternoon, a journalist asked him whether he felt vindicated. He paused, then replied quietly, "I don't think in terms of revenge. I think in terms of systems. When individuals fall, it's painful. When systems change, it's progress." Back in California, James Whitmore stood before the remaining employees of Whitmore Industries in the company auditorium. Rows of tired faces looked up at him. Engineers, technicians, analysts, men and women who had given their lives to the company only to wake up one day and see their futures collapse on national television. "We're not just changing policies," James told them. "We're changing who we are. This company was built on legacy, but legacy without integrity is nothing." He spoke without a teleprompter, his voice steadier than he expected. Behind him, banners that once bore the Whitmore crest now displayed a new motto: integrity through reform. He had hired a consultant to lead the overhaul, a woman named Dr. Maya Johnson, a former civil rights advisor whose reputation for honesty was as formidable as any general's. She was not afraid to show the company the mirror it had avoided for decades. Her first report was devastating. "Whitmore Industries," she read aloud during her presentation, "has exhibited a systemic culture of bias, favoritism, and racial exclusion spanning 15 years. Mrs. Whitmore's conduct was not an aberration. It was a symptom." The room was silent. Every executive who had once stood proudly beside Victoria's name now avoided eye contact. Dr. Johnson continued, "Change will not come from statements or donations. It will come from structure, from the willingness to confront the rot at the root." The board voted to adopt every recommendation she made: independent oversight, mandatory anti-bias training, whistleblower protections, and a new hiring system that prioritized transparency over pedigree. James didn't flinch. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. Loss of contracts, months of scrutiny, possible federal audits. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to clarity. The company would not survive if it didn't deserve to. Meanwhile, in Oakland, the once glamorous Victoria Whitmore was serving her first week of court-mandated community service. Her assigned placement was a small nonprofit called Haven House, a shelter for homeless veterans and families. The irony was not lost on anyone. The first morning she arrived, she wore designer sunglasses and a cream trench coat entirely unsuited for the work. The supervisor, a black woman in her 50s named Gloria, looked her over without judgment. "You can start by washing the dishes," she said. Victoria hesitated. The smell of industrial soap and metal trays was foreign to her. She had never been this close to the texture of labor. But she said nothing and obeyed. For the first week, the volunteers treated her like a ghost. They had seen the videos. Some had slept on the streets because of the same institutions her family had profited from. Yet slowly, as she kept showing up, scrubbing tables, serving meals, sorting donations, the hostility began to soften into wary curiosity. One afternoon, a man named Marcus, a veteran with a missing leg, looked up from his plate and said, "You're that lady from the video, ain't you?" Victoria froze. "Yes," she said quietly. He nodded. "Thought so. I didn't like you much that day, but you keep coming back, so maybe you're trying." She didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, she didn't have a rehearsed answer. As the days became weeks, the work began to change her. Not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet humiliations that peeled away her vanity. She learned the names of the people she served. She listened to their stories. A woman evicted after a medical bill, a veteran turned away from a hospital, a young mother juggling 3 jobs. She began to understand that the world she had lived in, the world of marble floors and silent servants, had been insulated by walls built from other people's suffering. At night, in her small studio apartment, she would sit on the edge of her bed and stare at her reflection. The mirror showed someone unrecognizable, hair tied back, hands raw from soap, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Yet for the first time in her life, the reflection didn't look hollow. General Richardson's reforms began taking root across Washington. The Pentagon announced new character and conduct assessment protocols for all defense contractors, a policy inspired directly by the Whitmore scandal. Technical excellence, he told Congress during testimony, means nothing if it's paired with moral bankruptcy. We cannot defend freedom abroad if we tolerate prejudice at home. The ripple spread quickly. The Department of Energy, Transportation, and even Education adopted similar review standards for their major vendors. Corporate America took note. Companies began firing executives with histories of discrimination, not to appease the public, but to pass new federal ethics screenings. The press called it the Richardson Standard. Within a year, it transformed the defense industry. Diversity became more than a slogan. It became a requirement for survival. A new generation of minority-owned contractors rose to prominence, and Whitmore Industries, rebuilt under James's leadership, was among the first to adopt the system completely. When Forbes profiled the company's rebirth, the headline read, "From Scandal to Standard, How Whitmore Industries Became a Model for Ethical Innovation." James's quote in the article was simple: "Sometimes you have to burn everything down to build something better." Victoria read that article at a bus stop on her way to the shelter. She folded the magazine carefully, her eyes lingering on James's photograph. He looked older but steadier. She felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Her divorce had finalized quietly. The prenup she had once dismissed as a formality left her with almost nothing. No shares, no mansion, no private accounts. She lived now in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a view of a parking lot. But poverty, she discovered, had its own strange clarity. For the first time, she earned something that wasn't inherited. The shelter began paying her a small stipend after her mandated hours ended, and she chose to stay. Not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to. One morning, Gloria handed her a clipboard. "You're organizing tomorrow's job workshop. Marcus needs help filling out his disability paperwork." Victoria nodded. She no longer flinched at being given orders. Later that day, as she helped Marcus complete a government form, he said quietly, "Funny, huh? You used to pour wine on people like me. Now you're helping me get my benefits." She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no accusation in his voice, only truth. "I know," she said softly, "and I think about that every day." He smiled. "Then maybe you're learning." A year passed. The city seemed smaller now, more human. Victoria's manicured hands had become calloused from work, her once flawless wardrobe replaced by second-hand sweaters and denim. She no longer avoided the news. She followed it. General Richardson had been promoted again, one of the youngest four-star officers in the country's history. His reforms had become doctrine. At Whitmore Industries, James's transformation of the company had turned it into one of the most diverse and socially responsible defense firms in America. Victoria's mother, Eleanor, visited her one afternoon at the shelter. She stood at the entrance watching her daughter distribute food to a line of people. When Victoria finally noticed her, she froze, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Eleanor said gently. Victoria wiped her hands and walked her outside. The air smelled faintly of rain and detergent. "I wanted to see you," Eleanor said, "and I wanted to say I'm proud of you." Victoria blinked, stunned. "Proud for what?" "I destroyed everything," her mother smiled sadly. "Yes, but you also forced something to change. Sometimes it takes a disaster to wake up a system. You showed the world what it looks like when arrogance collapses, and what it looks like when a person rebuilds herself from the ground up." Tears stung Victoria's eyes. She hadn't cried in months. "I hurt so many people, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever deserve forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve," Eleanor said. "It's something you live toward." When Eleanor left, Victoria stood outside for a long time watching the sun sink behind the city skyline. The world was different now, harsher, more honest. The same internet that had once destroyed her reputation was now filled with headlines celebrating reform, fairness, and accountability. Inside the shelter, a poster hung on the wall, "Dignity through service." She looked at it and realized that for the first time in her life, the word service no longer meant being served. She returned to her work, helping a young mother fill out an application for housing. Around her, people laughed softly. Children played, volunteers bustled in and out. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't prestige. But it was real. Months later, Whitmore Industries hosted a public event to commemorate their partnership with the newly reformed Defense Innovation Unit. James spoke on stage beside General Richardson, their handshake captured by cameras worldwide. "This partnership," Richardson said to the crowd, "is proof that people and institutions can change. Accountability is not punishment, it's evolution." The audience applauded. James nodded solemnly beside him. From the back of the crowd, unrecognized in plain clothes, Victoria watched them both. For a moment she felt the faint echo of her old life, the stage lights, the applause, but there was no longing in it. Only peace. She turned to leave before the cameras found her. The night air was cool, the city lights sharp against the horizon. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. She walked back toward the shelter where the evening shift awaited. The following spring, a local journalist wrote a feature titled, "The Woman Who Sparked a Revolution She Never Intended." It chronicled the lasting reforms triggered by the Winegate scandal. Increased diversity in federal contracting, ethical review boards across 17 agencies, and record participation of minority-led startups in defense innovation. It ended with a line that captured what history had already begun to decide. Her act was unforgivable, but her consequences changed a nation. In a quiet moment that same year, Victoria sat outside Haven House sorting papers for the job fair. The sky blushed with sunset. Marcus walked by leaning on his crutch and grinned. "You ever think about going back to your old life?" She looked up at him, smiling faintly. "No, I think this one finally makes sense." He nodded. "Funny how life works. You fall from a mansion and land right where you're supposed to be." She laughed, the sound light unguarded. Across town, General Richardson was giving another speech, this one to a group of young officers. "True power," he told them, "isn't in domination or status. It's in discipline, humility, and the courage to confront injustice, even when it hides behind respectability." The applause that followed was genuine, but Richardson's gaze drifted briefly toward the audience, as if remembering the moment that had started everything. A glass of red wine, a room full of silence, and a choice to stand tall instead of strike back. In time, the world would forget the hashtag, the outrage, the scandal's name. But the changes it sparked would remain written into the policies of governments, the practices of corporations, and the quiet, everyday decency of those who had learned by watching. And in a small shelter in Oakland, a woman who had once been the face of arrogance now spent her evenings wiping tables, filling forms, and teaching others how to stand again. The same hands that once poured humiliation now offered help. The same name that once symbolized disgrace had become, in the strangest way, part of redemption's story. Victoria Whitmore had lost everything the world valued, and in doing so had found the one thing it couldn't give her, a soul worth saving.